everyone, and welcome to the latest Patient Perspectives interview. Today we are joined by Front Line Genomics' very own Daisy Ireland. So before we begin, Daisy, if you could just introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about what you do as well.
Yeah, hello. I am a content and event producer for Front Line Genomics. I have a background in molecular biology and genetics. I studied at the University of East Anglia, and yeah, I'm also a rare disease patient.
Yeah, so obviously today we're going to be talking about your rare condition. So your rare condition is called Charcot-Marie Tooth. Could you just tell everyone a little bit about what that is and kind of what type you have as well and what symptoms are involved?
Yeah, so Charcot-Marie Tooth, or CMT, is a inherited neurological disorder. I have a specific type, which is type 1A. So this condition mainly affects the peripheral nerves. There are a lot of different types of CMT. I think there's 4 in total, with different sort of subgroups under it. All of them are caused by a fault in one of the particular genes involved in the development of the peripheral nerves. For me, it causes a mutation in the myelin sheath, which insulates the peripheral nerves, and this mutation causes them to slowly break down. The symptoms that this causes are quite varied, but for me, I experience sort of muscle weakness and wasting. I have high arched feet and hammer toes. And I also sort of experience problems with balance, which causes me to sort of trip and fall. Another part of it as well means that I don't have a reflex. So things like picking up a hot pan or something like that normal people would drop. I don't sort of respond to that painful trigger. So sort of hold on to it until you eventually end up feeling it and react to that pain stimuli. This was interesting at school because when you do that reflex test as a kid, where they hit your knees, I didn't have any response to that, and the teacher didn't quite understand why I wasn't responding to that. But yeah, another part of it as well is sort of having decreased sensation in my lower limbs, so sort of not responding to touch or anything like that.
When did you kind of first start having symptoms, and when did your family start to think, oh, there may be something that's not quite right?
Yeah, so it actually runs in my family. So you can have CMT that just is a random mutation that crops up first generation in the family, but we have a family history of it. So my mum was aware of it from a very young age. I've got 2 older siblings that also suffer with it, and she realised around 6 with them, at 6 years of age with them, whereas with me, she said she first started sort of seeing the symptoms develop about 5 months of age, and then when I learned to walk, the learning to walk was a little bit delayed. She saw by examining my feet that there was something there, so took us to get tested based off of her sort of examinations.
And when were you kind of diagnosed, and at the time, what kind of tests were run to kind of diagnose you at the time?
Yeah, so I think I was about 3 years of age when I first got diagnosed. This is quite early. Sometimes symptoms don't develop until sort of you're in your early teens. But for me, because my mum was familiar with it, I got tested very early on. The tests that they carried out back then were sort of tests of reflexes, examination of the feet and muscles, and we didn't have any genetic testing back then. Just because it wasn't offered and we had a family history of it. So just from those physical examinations, it was apparent that was the condition we had. My brother had something where they do a nerve conduction test, where they sort of stimulate your nerves with an electrode to see whether you have a reaction there. I didn't have that at that age just because it's quite a traumatic process. But that sort of helped with the diagnosis in this generation of my parents' children.
Yeah, and you said that both your siblings have it as well, and your mum has it. What kind of different symptoms do you all have, or you're quite similar?
Overall, we have quite similar symptoms. We have this sort of malformations of the feet. My brother has that slightly differently, where he's got quite flat feet, so it can either affect high arches or flat feet. And then we have it all in a sort of varying severity, but it's a degenerative condition as well. So it will progress as we get older. So our symptoms when we were younger were pretty mild, just sort of things like tripping and falling and things like that. And as we've got a little bit older, it becomes more apparent. And my mum suffers with it as well, and has sort of more severe sort of effects with walking and things like that, just as she's a bit older, obviously.
When did your family as a whole kind of realize that this condition kind of ran in the family? Because obviously you said that your mum kind of knew about it, so that was kind of easier for her to kind of recognize the symptoms in you guys. But when did the family as a whole kind of first realize that this was running in the family?
So we had, my grandma also had the condition, and my great grandmother, but neither of them got tested. They just knew that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until my mum had a couple of accidents at work. She dislocated her knees a couple of times, and tripped and fell, and badly broke her ankle. And it wasn't until those symptoms became apparent in my mum that the hospital that she went to go and get her ankle checked sent her to a referral to a neurologist who carried out the testing there, which was when CMT as a condition first got mentioned. So before that, they knew that there was something, but never got officially tested until that point. The testing for my mum was just the physical side of things, as genetic testing wasn't a thing offered back then. We have since been genetic tested, where they found that fault in the PMP22 gene, which is how we know we have type 1A. But yeah, at that point, I think my mum was around 22 years of age when she officially got diagnosed. But my grandmother never really talked about the condition, so my mum didn't know anything was wrong with her. She just thought she was a bit clumsy. So it was about then that we first knew that this condition ran in the family.
What was that like for your mum? Because obviously that's quite a late diagnosis, and obviously that happens a lot of the time in the rare disease community, but obviously going all those years and kind of not knowing, then all of a sudden being like, oh, you have this kind of genetic condition, and also it runs in your family, like that must have been like so crazy at the time for her to kind of deal with.
I think she never really, she said it wasn't that shocking. It was kind of more that, oh, that's why I'm clumsy, or that's why I tripped and fallen, or that's why I struggled at school with sport and was always picked last, or something like that. But she said the main thing was that her mum never wanted to get tested. She'd get quite frustrated with it if she got asked. I think it was just her preference, and didn't want to admit that there was something there. And I think with us, she's always been very, very open about talking about it, just because of her experience of not really knowing. She said though that she never really understood that this could be passed on to her children. So although she got diagnosed with it, there wasn't really any support given for, there's a autosomal dominant condition, so it could be passed to your children with a 50% chance. So she has two older siblings, neither of them have it, so she just presumed that her children would more than likely be fine with it. And she said that's one of the things she struggles with most now, just knowing that she's passed this condition on to us that obviously affects our quality of life. So she thinks that there's some sort of guilt there for that side of things.
What has it been like for you? I mean, kind of having that support network, because obviously your mum has it and you have siblings that have it as well. And I suppose you can kind of relate to each other and kind of share in that. What has that experience been like for you? Because as you said, like your mum didn't really have that because your nan didn't really want to speak about it too much. But what has that kind of openness that your mum has kind of had and shared with you been like for you?
I think it's really important, and I think for me it's been nice if you're struggling with something, only people that really have it or have a similar thing can properly sort of empathize with what you're going through. So having people there that you can sort of explain, I've struggled with this today because of this part of it, or like they can pick up on when you're struggling and know how to help you and things like that, because it causes fatigue a lot of the time, so you can become really, really tired easily. So I think having people there that understand and not having to go through the steps of explaining it as well to people that don't know the condition is makes it a lot easier to open up about it. But I think my mum being open about it as well has helped me be a lot more open to to discuss it with other people, which has been a really important part as well.
Yeah. And what has it been like for you kind of growing up with it as well, and trying to explain it to friends, teachers, like employers and things like that?
I think when I was younger, I never really spoke about it at all, just from my own not really wanting to accept that there was something there, or just not thinking that people would understand in any capacity. But I've definitely got a lot better about speaking about it and opening up. Friends are always really understanding, and sort of there's nothing to be embarrassed about having it, so you might as well tell them. Teachers, that was a little bit more difficult, especially with sports, like sports and PE classes. I was never very good at those. So I think there was one time especially where I tried to explain to a teacher that I had this condition that that affected me, so I couldn't do that particular activity. And just out of a lack of understanding of what it was, they turned around and said, "Oh, but there's nothing wrong with your teeth." Just because of the name of the condition, Charcot-Marie Tooth, they just presumed it affected your teeth, and it wasn't a neurological condition. So I think there's just a real lack of understanding of conditions that sort of can make it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. And what kind of impact, as you said, like kind of living with this invisible illness, I suppose, what impact has that had on kind of your mental health, and kind of dealing with that yourself, and get the kind of frustration, as you said, like trying to make people understand it and things like that?
I think sometimes it does knock my confidence. I think especially in group scenarios, sometimes if there was sort of at work a team leading or a team building experience that might have been something that was a physical activity, and I'd always be a bit nervous about saying, "Oh, I'm actually can't participate in that," or I might struggle with that a bit. That's something I've struggled with, just sort of having to open up and explain it, and go about it that way. But I think also sometimes I struggle to admit that I can't do something, or I will stop myself from taking part in certain things just because I don't want to admit that I would struggle with it, or I don't want to fail at it. So it sometimes prevents me from taking up opportunities just because I know I might struggle with it. I might enjoy it in the long run, I might be able to do it, but I might not actually give it a try if I'm worried that I won't be able to do it. So that's something I've had to overcome more recently. That is difficult, but I think you just got to take everything as it comes.
Do you think that there is kind of enough support for young individuals who grow up with these rare conditions that a lot of the time are invisible? And do you think there is enough support network out there to try and kind of help you like throughout life and come to terms with your condition and meet other people and things like that?
I think there definitely is a lot more now. When I was growing up, I don't remember there being much, or I don't remember there being much spoken about. That might just have been from my personal experience. We were part of a natural history study a few years ago. I think I was in my teenage years. And we met a couple of patients then that had also had the condition, but up until that point, I'd never met anyone else with it apart from that was in my immediate family. So it kind of felt a little bit like there wasn't anyone else out there that also suffered with it. There were a couple of times when I'd go for my hospital checkups where they'd mention that there were charities and organisations out there that support people with CMT. And I now know that there are sort of ones, a lot of them are based in the US, which is interesting. I don't know whether it's just because of the larger population or a lack of funding here for it. But there's US organisations such as the Charcot-Marie Tooth organisation. I think there's a UK one called Charcot-Marie Tooth UK, which is a charity that supports people and how they can live with CMT. But
you mentioned that you were involved in a kind of a clinical trial like study, and you're also currently involved in a natural history study for a clinical trial. Would you be able to just kind of expand on what that is and how you got involved in that study as well?
Yeah, so I still have regular checkups at Queen Square Institute of Neurology in London. I think that's the main hub for treating or sort of assessing patients with CMT in the UK. And we just got reached out to based on being a long-standing patient there, and they mentioned that they were going to be carrying out this study. And I think with my interest in genetics, I jumped at it because I just thought it's finding out more about it, and also can potentially help people like myself, and also in future generations. So the study itself is called ACT-CMT, and it's basically to monitor the progression of the condition. It's degenerative, as I mentioned before, so it's basically tracking how the symptoms and how the muscle weaknesses and things like that will progress as we age. So we get seen at different intervals. I think it's 6, 12 and 24 months. And we go through a series of physical tests. So the last appointment I had, they took blood samples, they do a skin biopsy of the wrist, basically seeing whether there's any sort of Schwann cells that can be found in the skin which have been broken down from the myelin sheath. So they basically see whether there is that apparent nerve degeneration there. And they also carry out sort of physical tests where they look at our muscles and everything like that. And yeah, it's basically to see whether this potential drug that I think they're testing at the moment in rat and mice, they're testing whether the progression of that compares to the progression seen in humans.
And do you know specifically kind of what this drug will be doing, and kind of what pathway or will it be acting on and things like that?
I believe it's a antisense oligonucleotide, so it will help prevent the actual degradation of the myelin sheath. So it will block the myelin sheath from being broken down, which is what causes the symptoms in CMT type 1A.
Yeah, I know that the trial is obviously still kind of ongoing and you're still taking part, but in terms of patient voice, in your opinion, how kind of involved do you feel in this study, and how much input do you have as a patient, and get to kind of share your voice about how it's been conducted and things like that?
So I think for me, they were really, really good at explaining the background, why the study was needed. They sent a load of paperwork out beforehand so that we could understand the different parts of it, why those particular tests were needing to be done. And it was nice, as when I went to the actual appointment, they found out that I studied genetics or had a background in genetics, and took a really long time explaining in depth the specific details of the condition, the specific drug, blah, blah, blah. And that was really nice that they clearly had a passion there and took the time to explain it to me. But I think the one thing is that as the checkups are obviously tracking the progress, they're quite far apart. So it can be quite difficult to feel part of it still, because we don't get any updates in between. We don't really hear about what's happened in the progress of it, or whether there's any advancements, setbacks, or anything like that. So I think having more of an update and more of a sort of touch base more frequently would be nice, to just sort of understand what we are doing, how that actually helps benefit other people. I think that would be a really nice way to make us feel more involved.
Yeah, aside from your clinical trial, what are the ways that pharma companies and research institutes can ensure that they incorporate patient voice a bit more in clinical trial design? Because I know that's a really big kind of issue for rare disease patients in particular, just trying to get their voice earlier on in these studies, rather than kind of later on when they need patients to participate.
I think it would be nice to have permanent information put out there about these conditions, and having sort of a base to go to, so that it's not just, we need your help now, so we're going to advertise. Whereas if they constantly try to put material out there that spoke about these rare diseases or specific conditions that weren't the top few conditions that are really well researched at the moment, like key areas, having more out there permanently, sort of annually, can make you feel more of a part of it. And I think even just having some sort of forum for patients to go to together would be nice.
And kind of expanding on that as well, how can the government and various organizations do more to kind of raise awareness about these conditions? Because obviously rare diseases are rare, but people do have them, and obviously it's so important to get that information out there, just to kind of diagnose it early, I suppose, because the more people know about it, the easier it will eventually become to diagnose these conditions. Because as you said, like for your mum, it took years for her to get diagnosed because people didn't really speak about it and people don't really know about it. So how do you think that these kind of organizations can do more to help and raise awareness?
And it is difficult, like you mentioned, rare diseases are rare, so you're not going to hear as much about it, but I know that there is a Charcot-Marie Tooth week, so things like Alzheimer's week that everyone is familiar with, like cancer research, everything like that. They're such common conditions, but I think putting more out there to advertise that these support weeks or these support groups that I mentioned before, having these associations mentioned, is so important to understand how people can get help. I think especially for families where it crops up in the first generation by a random mutation, I'm lucky that I can talk to my family about it because they know what we've been through. We have a family history of it, so we got diagnosed early. But for people that don't have that, having some information out there that is easy to go to must be so important. And I think there is support there for people like myself with these conditions that result in a disability, that there's support for, say, going to university and things like that, but you never really hear about it. I got offered this support based on my siblings going through it as well, so I knew it was there, but I think a lot of people don't know that that support is there. So I think actively advertising that is a really important thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to mention, because I know for a lot of people, they don't even realize that there are schemes available and things like that to get that extra support. What was that like for you? Like, I mean, kind of across your life, I suppose, like uni, at school, and like in the workplace, what has it been like for you to try and get that kind of extra support, I suppose, in areas that you may need it?
I myself went through the disabled student allowance for university, and that meant that the university was already aware of my condition before I went. For me, that was really important because it helped me set up stuff like I was entitled to extra time. So all of that was already set up for me by the government contacting the university on my behalf and making them aware of this condition. I think for workplaces, there is a real lack of understanding of how they as an employer can benefit us. So I obviously disclose it when I get offered a position, but I think people not necessarily understanding how the condition can benefit or impact their lives and how they can then be of a benefit. As it is a little bit of an awkward topic to talk about a lot of the time, I think people sort of shy away from it. So unless you actively seek out that help, a lot of the time it cannot be given. So I think making it more of a topic that people are happy to talk about and happy to approach that individual themselves will help people to seek that support.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we can have this interview without mentioning the fact that you obviously do work for Front Line Genomics. What made you kind of want to go into science, and has that kind of helped you cope with your condition and understand it a bit more as you've grown up?
So yeah, obviously I had I knew about genetics from an early age based on the countless hospital appointments I had to go to and the numerous checkups I had where they would mention the genetic background, the genetic chances of it being passed on and everything like that. So it definitely made me aware of what it is. And then I remember the concept of being offered genetic counselling being brought up for when I was a little bit older. I think I was secondary school age. That was made aware to me that that would be a possibility that we would be offered. And knowing that I could seek support from a professional to sort of understand how that condition can be passed on through families, I found that fascinating. And I think that is what really changed my opinion about studying genetics. It made me realise that it's not just mainly the lab work. Your work can have a real impact on patients' lives and passing on that condition to the next generation. And I think my studying it has meant that I sought more information about it. And even with this trial, I don't think I would have been as readily involved if I didn't care as much about the genetic makeup of what caused this condition to develop in the first place.
And how kind of do you think that you can use the platform that you have now, I suppose, with this, obviously Front Line Genomics is kind of a media company, to kind of raise awareness about the condition?
I think interviews like this and putting content out there that is free and readily accessible for the population, like you can Google Charcot-Marie Tooth and there not be that much that comes up apart from sort of information on what the condition is. Having a platform to talk about how it can affect individuals as people suffering from the condition is really, really important, because a lot of the time you don't necessarily hear that. So not just putting out the information about specifically what causes it, the symptoms, diagnosis, etc. Having patient voice and patient impact and just having a platform for people to share their experiences is so important.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree. What would you kind of say to someone who has been diagnosed recently or is growing up with CMT? What would be the one message that you would kind of give them?
I think mine would be to not be shy to tell people what it is. And I think that is where this awareness of the condition will begin. If people share their experiences, are readily sort of happy to speak about suffering from it. I didn't really do that when I was growing up because I didn't think I could, or I thought I'd get strange looks. So I think knowing that it is okay to mention that they have this condition and that might be why they're struggling with a certain task, and just share your experience and seek sort of understanding from people that are also going through it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for joining me today, Daisy. It's been really great, and I think it's so important for people to share their stories. But I always get excited when people share their stories who have a genetic condition, but then have used that to kind of go into the field and kind of further their understanding and things like that. And I think it's so important that people share their stories even more, as you said, and kind of speak up about it and not be shy to kind of say that they have a condition and they're proud as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Hello everyone, if you enjoyed this video then make sure you check out some of our other videos in our series by subscribing below or going to our website frontlinegenomics.com. I hope you enjoy.